Environmental Impact Assessment. What is Environmental Impact Assessment? A study to identify, predict, evaluate, and communicate information about the impacts on the environment of a proposed project and to detail out the mitigating measures prior to project approval and implementation. The evolution of environmental impact assessment. Environmental impact assessments commenced in the 1960s as part of increasing environmental awareness, especially in U.S. and other industrial industries. Due to these environmental concerns, in the early 1970s, environmental impact assessment was first introduced. Then, in 1970s to 1980s, the scope became bigger in order to cater the environmental issues. In mid to late 1980s, the process of environmental impact assessment was strengthened with the integration of the policy. And in mid-1990s until now, the focus of the environmental impact assessment is towards sustainability. Objectives of environmental impact assessment: to modify and improve design, to ensure efficient resources use, to enhance social aspects, to protect human health and safety. To identify the key impacts and measures for mitigating them, to inform decision-making and condition setting, and also to avoid serious and irreversible damage to the environment.
Why environmental impact assessment is important.
Of course, environmental impact assessment is important. It ensures that the potential problems are foreseen and addressed at an early stage in the project planning and design. I will give you an example. A forest is a complete ecosystem, which provides food, shelter to a wide variety of species. It provides firewood, timber, water catchment area, medicinal herbs, and so on, to us humans. Whenever a project is undertaken which demands clearing of the forest, like construction of road or a dam, environmental impact assessment helps us to assess the impact of that activity on this lifeline. It is also suggests mitigation plans from this assessment.
So, what are the benefits of environmental impact assessment?
There are several benefits of this assessment. Firstly, it is environmentally sound and sustainable design. Better compliance with the standards. Savings in capital and operating costs. Reduced time and costs for approvals. Increased project acceptance. And also better protection of the environment and human health.
Hello everyone. In order to conduct environmental impact assessment, there are 10 steps of operation practices that need to be followed.
After a project is proposed, screening process will be conducted before an assessment takes place. Screening must be done whether activities required an environmental impact assessment or not. This step determines whether or not environmental impact assessment is required for a particular project. Level of assessment is also determined in this step. So far, there are 19 activities requires environmental impact assessment. Screening is important for identification of potential significant adverse environmental effects.
Usually, this step is carried out secondly after the initial activities, because it requires expert opinion. However, for cost saving and budget purposes, this step can be done with available expert in-house.
For the screening outcomes, a particular project is either required full or comprehensive environmental impact assessment, limited environmental impact assessment, or not required environmental impact assessment at all.
Step 2 is the initial activities. The elements required in initial activities are identifying related decision-making bodies, identifying related laws and regulation, preparing a report preparation schedule, identifying the experts required, election of main coordinator, which is the environmental impact assessment team leader, and distributing the work among the expert team members with the expected deadline of completion.
All environmental impact assessment requires a good initial activities planning and involvement of field-specific experts.
Step 3, Scoping. There are 2 elements required in this step. Firstly, identification of project possible alternatives and impacts. Secondly, discussions between the developer or relevant agency and authority such as Department of Environment, change of specific land space and other alternatives can be employed at this stage. Step 4 is the baseline studies. Baseline studies is one of the most important parts of environmental impact assessment procedure. This step is about assembly of relevant information on the current status of a project area. All information of existing environmental condition are gathered, which are about the physical characteristics, hydrology and water quality, air and meteorology, noise, geology and soil, socioeconomics, habitat and species, infrastructure and facilities, and also utilities and services. Anticipation of the future environmental condition after the project is also considered.
It is important to do comparison after the project when carried out for monitoring purposes.
Step 5 is about the impact prediction. This step is important to forecast environmental impacts using prediction models and mathematical equation. This step is the most scientific part in environmental impact assessment. It requires the elected expert output. The mere prediction models and mathematical equations for specific environmental impacts are as follow. For soil, they usually using the universal soil loss equation. For solid and hazardous waste, they are using the crude waste estimation equation. Air dispersion models are usually used for air quality. For traffic impact, traffic generation and flow models are used. Cost-benefit analysis is normally used for socioeconomic. For water quality, biochemical oxygen demand estimation model is used. For noise impact, traffic and industry model are used, and for flood, urban drainage design standard procedure is referred.
The impact assessment is in step 6. This step evaluating the significance of impact to the environment. For this assessment, it usually determined by assessment method, professional judgment, and reference to regulatory bodies. Impact assessment can be done by using various methods such as network method, matrix method, diagram method, overlay method, GIS method, stimulations method, ad hoc method and checklist method. The checklist methods are widely used in Malaysia due to Department of Environmental Requirement and the guidelines.
Step 7 is about the mitigation. This step is very important because the identified negative impacts are alleviated. The steps that are usually employed in practice is avoid, reduce, remedy, compensate and enhance. The step-by-step mitigation measures are usually employed to eliminate, reduce and compensate all the identified significant impacts. The details of mitigation measures adopted are very important to be carried out without negligence to avoid any future problem. This step is also significant as to recognize unexpected impacts and remedial action to be taken. It also verify the impact arises whether it is same with the prepared report.
Next step is the report preparation. Environmental impact report is usually submitted to the regulatory bodies such as Department of Environment for decision-making, review and project approval. This report is also called as Environmental Impact Statement or Environmental Impact Assessment.
The necessary chapters required in Preliminary Environmental Impact Statement under the EIA 1987 and Chapter 5 Environmental Impact Assessment Guidelines are Executive Summary, Project Title, Project Initiator, Statement of Need, Project Description, Project Option, Existing Environment Description, Significant Impact, Mitigation and Abatement, Residual Impacts, Summary and Conclusion, List of References and lastly, Data Sources or Appendix.
Step 9 is about decision making. Environmental impact statement is sent to decision makers for further action that comprise the local regulatory bodies, team of environmental impact statement consultant, and the local public members which are appointed by Department of Environment. Report must contain various alternatives that enable the decision maker to choose one of them. The decision maker may require further investigation on certain aspects to gain public confidence. After this process, the construction of the project can be started if approved with or without extra condition.
Lastly, Step 10, which is the monitoring or execution of environmental management plan. This is the final stage whereby the project has already started and various environmental management plan contractors are already appointed for ongoing monitoring at site.
This step is usually critical because the permission for construction is already granted, and it is the project proponent's duty to ensure all mitigation measure recorded in environmental impact statement is well conducted, to avoid the project to stop by the Department of Environment or due to public complaints.
An environmental management plan must at least contain the following items. All environmental management plan contractors and consultant must follow Department of Environmental EMP reference handbook.
Let's start with a case study. Three people were killed while 20 others were still missing after a landslide occurred in Green Hill on Friday. 7 containers used to hold workers at the construction site were covered in the landslide and 20 workers were feared buried alive. The tragedy happened at the construction zone of the road project on the Central Hill side of the area. It was learned that the buried victims were the construction workers. The search and rescue operation by the Fire and Rescue Department is still ongoing while survivors have been sent to the hospital. This tragedy had arisen lots of issues and questions, especially regarding their EIA report. So does the road project require EIA report? What are the requirements needed for EIA report? Let's discover this. Hi Professor, we are here to ask about requirement for EIA report. Does a road construction project at the Hill area required an EIA report?
EIA or Environmental Impact Assessment is a study to identify, predict, evaluate and communicate information about the impacts on the environment of a proposed project and to detail out the mitigating measures prior to project approval and implementation. This is a legal requirement under the EIA, which under the Environmental Quality Act 1974. Section 34A. This section had stated that any person intending to carry out any prescribed activity shall appoint a qualified person to conduct an environmental impact assessment and to submit a report thereof to the Director General of Environment.
Thank you, Professor, for that. But just now you mentioned about prescribed activities. What are prescribed activities?
Prescribed activities referred to the activities in the first schedule and second schedule as in the Environmental Quality. Prescribed activities, Environmental Impact Assessment, Order 2015. First schedule do not require public display and public comment unless otherwise instructed by the Director General. While the activities specified in the second schedule require public display and public comment. In the first schedule, there are 21 activities listed. While in the second schedule, there are 17 activities. For detailed explanations for each activities in the first schedule and second schedule, you can always refer to the Environmental Quality, Prescribed Activities, Environmental Impact Assessment, Order 2015.
Thank you very much, Professor, for answering and sharing with us about EIA. So we had heard an explanation regarding activities that listed under EIA Order 2015. Next, let's meet an environmental agency officer for more detail. Hello, officer. Can you explain some of the specific requirements of EIA?
EIA is not a new thing in Malaysia. Every project that falls under first schedule and second schedule of the EIA Order 2015 is required to provide EIA report. Under EIA Order 2015, any person intending to carry out any prescribed activity shall appoint a qualified person to conduct and submit an EIA.
Qualified person? Who is qualified person?
Qualified person is a person who fulfills the requirement as the Director General may determine to conduct an environmental audit and environmental impact assessment, and to submit a report thereon. This person is responsible for EIA and its recommendation. Ensure that the report and the recommendation do not contain any false or misleading information. And take a professional indemnity insurance for any liability arising from its recommendation. Other important thing as in EIA Order 2015 is, if the EIA is approved, the person shall provide sufficient proof that the conditions attached to the report are being complied with and that the proposed measures to prevent or control adverse environmental impacts. And one last thing which is important for you to know under this order is prohibition. The Director General may issue a prohibition order or stop work order to the person carry out any prescribed activities without approval under subsection 34A3. Any person who contravenes Section 34A can be penalized to a fine not exceeding 500,000 ringgit or to imprisonment for a period not exceeding 5 years or both.
Thank you very much, officer, for all the information that you had shared just now. So we had listened a lot of information regarding environmental impact assessment. So how about Green Hill case? Based on EIA Order 2015, Green Hill need to provide EIA report as the development is at a slope and hill area. As in the first schedule of EIA Order 2015, it stated that development or land clearing less than 50% of an area with slope greater than or equal to 25 degrees but less than 35 degrees. Green Hill reported to have a 30-degree slope, and these conditions cause it to fall under first schedule and need to provide an EIA report. If the slope is more than 35 degree, the activity will fall under second schedule. In theory, the existing law can be an effective preventive tool provided all parties, including developers and local authorities, comply with the law requirements.
Hello everyone. Today our lessons are concept of environmental impact assessment. Let's get started now.
Consideration of environmental impact assessment are divided into two topics: project concept and site selection.
What is the criteria for project concept in environmental impact assessment study?
Project proponent must make sure that the concept of the proposed project not contradict any development plans, policies or any decisions of the government of Malaysia prior to the EIA study, namely, but not limited to the following.
There are several criteria needed to be understood in project concepts, such as national physical plan, structure plan, local plan, regional plan, interstate planning. Agreement between the government of Malaysia and Kualiti Alam SDNBHD on the disposal of scheduled wastes in Malaysia. Agreement between the government of Malaysia and Pantai Medivest SDNBHD, Faber Mediserve SDNBHD and Radicare SDNBHD on the disposal of clinical wastes from government hospitals. Guidelines on highland development, Garius Banjun Pambangunan di Kawasan Tanah Tinggi, and guidelines on siting and zoning of industries.
The criteria for selecting a new site normally include engineering, environmental and economic aspects. Then, these sites are then investigated further for their suitability, through site visits and analyses of existing information. During this stage, measures to protect the environment and to resolve socio-economic issues also considered. Furthermore, where the project is situated on private/individual land or neat waterways, and the issue of compensation and offset investment should be addressed in the EIA. Project proponent is encouraged not to select site which is located in or adjacent to environmentally sensitive area, ESA, as defined in National Physical Plan, April 2005. ESA shall be integrated in the planning and management of land use and natural resources to ensure sustainable development.
The management of ESA shall be guided by the following criteria. First, ESA Rank 1, no development, agriculture or logging shall be permitted except for low-impact nature tourism, research and education. Second, ESA Rank 2, no development or agriculture. Sustainable logging and low-impact nature tourism may be permitted subject to local constraints. Third, ESA Rank 3, controlled development, where the type and intensity of the development shall be strictly controlled depending on the nature of the constraints.
The areas defined as environmentally sensitive as demarcated in IP8 of the National Physical Plan are ESA Rank 1 first, all protected areas, refer to National Physical Plan, potential protected areas, wetlands and turtle landing sites. Secondly, catchment of existing and proposed dams. Thirdly, all areas above 1,000 m contour. Secondly, ESA Rank 2 all other forests, corridors linking important protected areas, buffer zone around Rank 1 areas. Next, all areas between 300 m 1,000 m contour. ESA Rank 3 firstly, all marine park islands, buffer zone around Rank 2 areas. Secondly, catchment for water intakes and groundwater extraction, well fields. Thirdly, all areas between 150 m 300 m contour, all areas with erosion risk above 150 tons per hectare year, all areas experiencing critical or significant coastal erosion. All sources from National Physical Plan, April 26, 2005.
Some general criteria relevant to all projects are as below. Appropriate buffer zones should be included with respect to a specific category of development projects, for example industrial projects, solid waste handling and disposal facilities, landfills, incinerators, composting plants, and so on. Those guidelines for the siting and zoning of industries, latest revision, can be used as a general guide, subject to the findings of the Environmental Impact Assessment.
Air pollution should be located to minimize air pollution and odor impact from point and fugitive sources, where emissions of carcinogenic or mutagenic substances is possible due. Account should be made for health risks. While for water pollution, siting a facility along water courses can cause their eventual degradation and affect critical beneficial uses downstream, such as public water supply, intake, fisheries or basic riverine livelihood. Water catchment area should be avoided.
Proximity is the facility should be distant to sensitive potential receptors of impacts such as schools, places of worship, nursing homes, and hospitals.
For social or cultural needed to avoid populated areas, parks and scenic areas. Public participation and local interest groups consultation to gain local acceptance, and an assessment of the impact on cultural resources would be necessary.
Access or utilization of secondary roadways or streets is undesirable because of noise impacts and traffic congestion on routes not designed for heavy truck use.
Geology or hydrology. Siting of facilities, for example industries, scheduled wastes facilities, solid wastes landfills, should have due regard for their potential to contaminate groundwater reserves.
Waste disposal or raw materials site near to sources of principal raw materials and ensure availability of adequate waste disposal facilities.
Next, risks of toxic clouds, fire and explosion. Locate so that the outer hazard distances coincide with the outer boundary of the buffer zone and human settlements.
Noisy secluded locations are best if feasible. If not, suitable buffers and distances from human dwellings must be kept.
Land value. We need to know that land value and property value are likely to be affected by the placement of industrial facilities in a given area, the type of land use along roadways leading to the site entrance, and the degree of residential development in the vicinity need to be considered.
For ecology, need to avoid unique habitat areas. City and plant or the ecologically or environmentally sensitive habitats, e.g. mangroves, estuaries, wetland, coral reefs.
May I know who can conduct the EIA study?
Has to be conducted by competent individuals who are registered with the Departments of Environment, DOE, under the EIA Consultant Registration Scheme. EIA reports will be rejected by DOE if it conducted by non-registered individual with the department. Furthermore, EIA study team leader has to ensure all members in EIA study team need to be registered with DOE.
Let's visit Departments of Environment website www.gov.my. There are some information available in this website such as the list of registered EIA consultants, including subject consultants and assistant consultants, details on the registration scheme, EIA Consultant Registration Guidance document.
Hello, Paul. I have something in my mind. May I ask you what are the ensuring fairness in the EIA process?
For sure, Julie. I will explain it for you first. You need to register consultants' names and terms of reference. Secondly, name consultants and their expertise in the EIA report. Thirdly, publish the terms of reference in the EIA report and make it available to the public. Last but not least, publish list of screening and final decisions along with conditions for approval.
What are the next learning regarding EIA study? Next, we are learning regarding EIA guiding principles. There are 9 principles on it. Let's go further details.
Purposive, meeting its aims and objectives.
Focused, concentrating on the effects that matter.
Adaptive, responding to issues and realities.
Transparent, clear and easily understood.
Participative, fully involving the public.
Rigorous, employing best practicable methodology.
Practical, establishing mitigation measures that work.
Credible, carried out with objectively and professionalism.
Efficient, imposing least cost burden on proponents.
There are several key operating principles of good environmental impact assessment practice.
Be applied to all proposals with significant impacts. Begin early in the project cycle. Address relevant environmental, social, and health impacts. Identify and take account of public views. Result in a statement of impacts and mitigation measures. Facilitate informed decision-making and condition setting. The quality of an EIA depends largely on the proper identification of the environmental and social aspects that may be subject to direct and indirect impacts from the proposed activity or project. A clearly defined project scope is the basis of an adequate EIA. Therefore, identifying the relevant issues and concerns from the beginning is an essential part of the EIA process. If the scope is too narrow, the EIA might overlook significant impacts that are not necessarily obvious but real and possibly negative, or leave out stakeholders who would be affected by an activity or project. If the scope is too broad or unclear, the EIA can become overstretched and overburdened with irrelevant issues, require unnecessary efforts, and distract from the analysis of key issues. With new development projects, there is a risk of generating site-specific impacts, as well as impacts on the surrounding areas. The risks and impacts do not always decrease with an increase in distance from the project site. Some impacts are obvious, while others are not. The scoping phase should take place in the beginning of the EIA process, and ideally include the participation of the reviewer. The participation of reviewers in this phase shapes the EIA process, including the scope, purpose, alternatives, area of study, resources, and the type of assessment. Unfortunately, scoping is often done before the reviewers are involved. In many cases, EIA reviewers are left to determine after the fact whether the scoping was done correctly, whether the correct number of topics and scenarios were contemplated, and whether all the information and perspectives were considered. Was there an opportunity to solicit views and comments from all the key stakeholders? Who was involved or consulted in the process of preparing the EIA, and in what way? The benefits of communicating with and involving all stakeholders is important, especially during the EIA review.
Technical experts may overlook key information or areas of study that local citizens and communities can more easily identify due to their proximity to the potentially affected areas and greater stake in the outcome. Fortunately, when trying to assess or define the scope of an EIA, reviewers do not have to guess. Some helpful criteria for evaluating the adequacy of the scoping include the following. Are potentially significant issues and interactions for natural and human environments indicated? Are insignificant issues identified and their exclusion from further assessment justified? Are the viewpoints of all stakeholders considered? Are the spatial and temporal scopes of the EIA defined in sufficient detail? Is an adequate geographic area considered? Are any significant issues omitted? Are key issues and situations clarified? After confirming that the scoping has been done correctly, the reviewer ensures that there is a solid foundation for a well-focused and complete EIA. The EIA will serve as the basis for decision-making and defining the appropriate requirements for the project proponents. Additionally, the scoping stage provides valuable input for analyzing the alternatives for project siting and design. Ultimately, this can help avoid unnecessary and significant impacts and lead to more sustainable projects.
So we will be discussing EIA, its legal basis, and also the EIA process. And I will give you a very short example of an EIA project, which is a copper gold mine project. I think this is in the Philippines, as far as I can remember. All right, so in the whole world, as you can see in the map, the blue ones are actually countries. So as you can see on the map, the blue ones are actually the countries that practice or actually that has an EIA system. And as you can see, it's like almost all of the countries in the whole world has an EIA system, except of course on I think this is Greenland, right? I hope can still remember my geography. I think this is Finland. I think this is beside China, that would be Mongolia, I think. Some parts of this is not Central Asia, but this is the part of, I think, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan somewhere. And then I forgot this area. I think this is somewhere in the Middle East. And of course, Africa does not practice EIA system. But overall, almost all countries in the whole world has a existing EIA system. So, for example, the first country that actually implemented. All right, so as you can see on the table, it's actually the US, United States of America, that first established or implemented EIA system. So they started in 1969, followed by a few countries, and then followed by us, the Philippines, which we started our EIA system in 1978, and that's actually like only 9-year difference between the US and the Philippines. And to that, I would say I'm actually proud that Philippines is one of the first countries who has the EIA system, because as we all know, as what we discussed last meeting, the EIA is very important for us to assess the possible impacts of a certain project. So the strength of the EIA system actually depends on the strength of the legal and institutional. All right, I hope it will function this time. So going back to our EIA legal basis. So as I said earlier, the strength of the EIA system depends on the strength of the legal and institutional structures that support it. So without a legal policy of the EIA system, of course, who would abide it if we don't have any institutional Philippine law about it, in which policies and laws on EIA may vary from one country to another. And in the Philippines, the EIA system finds support in the constitutional provisions and various presidential decrees, in which most developing countries in Asia have established framework for environmental protection and environmental management, in which, based on our Philippine Constitution, of course, everything or all laws are actually based on our Philippine Constitution, which is the Philippine Constitution 1987. Article 2, Section 15 provides that the state shall protect and promote the people's right to health. And also quoting on Section 16, that the state shall protect and advance the right of the people to a balanced and healthful ecology in accord with the rhythm and harmony of nature. So that's the first father of legal basis of the EIA system, which is the Philippine Constitution. Actually, almost all laws it's almost all Philippine laws, its main basis is actually the Philippine Constitution. However, after such time, we formulated policies and laws, but actually we just made it so specific and with specific details, but actually all laws and policies and presidential decrees are actually came from, or it's actually based from the Philippine Constitution. So, for example, in 1969, the Congress passed the National Environmental Policy, or NEPA, which requires EIA to be carried out. In our presidential decree in our EIA system, which is the 1977 Environmental Policy, it states that it is hereby declared a continuing policy of the state to create, develop, maintain, and improve the conditions under which man and nature can strive any productive and enjoyable harmony with each other. And of course, it is also to fulfill the social, economic, and other requirements of present and future generations of Filipino and ensure the attainment of the environmental quality that is conducive to life of dignity and well-being. And then it was transformed into PD 1586, in which an environmental impact statement system, which dates back in 1978, which centralizes the EIA system under the National Environmental Protection Council, or NEPC. However, today it is now called as the AMB, or Environmental Management Bureau, which is under DNR, and authorizes the President and the NEPC to proclaim projects and activities subject to the EAS system. And after that, there were another implementing rules and regulation of the PD 1586, which is dated back in 1979, which defines parameters for EIS, established penalty structure for non-compliance, and creates EIA review committee, establishes procedures for implementing the EIS system, provides for exemptions, and establishes procedures for public hearings related to the EIS system. If we are going to put it in a timeline, this is actually the timeline of our environmental impact statement system. We started with PD 1586, which is in 1978. We established an environmental impact statement system. And then in 1979 to 1984, we established NEPC IRR, which is the first IRR. IRR means internal revenue allotment. So NEPC means National Environmental Protection Council, which is now EMB. And then the second IRR was in 1984 to 1982, which is another resolution number 4 from NEPC. And then from 1992 to 1996, which is the third IRR, we developed the Dow 21, which is Dow 21 series of 1992. And then on the fourth IRR, we developed the Dow 37 series of 1996, which was from 1996 to 2003. And of course, the Dow that we are using now, the Dow 30 series of 2003, or we call it sometimes as Dow 3003 or Dow 2003, which is the fifth IRR, in which it's actually the document that we are using up to today from 2003 when it comes to the EIA, or the environmental impact statement system. So again, on the presidential decree Presidential Decree 1586 in the year 1978. I would like to quote this, that no person, partnership, or corporation shall undertake or operate any such declared environmental critical project or area without first securing an ECC or an environmental compliance certificate. So, to that, what you might ask as to what are these projects, what are these environmental critical projects or environmental critical areas that is under the category that would force us, or I say that would require us for an ECC. So this is the first category. I hope you can see it in your end. So this is the first category. These are the category A, which is the environmental critical projects. So first one is heavy industries. Everything that is a heavy industry project should or will really require an ECC. So first example is non-ferrous metal industries, iron and steel mills, petroleum and petrochemical industries, and of course, smelting plants. Next example or next environmental critical project is the resource extractive industry. So when we say resource extractive, of course, it involves mining. So major mining and quarrying projects, forestry projects, and fishery projects. The third example or the third project that is under the category A is the infrastructure projects. So for example, major dams requires an ECC, major power plants requires an ECC, of course, major reclamation projects, and major roads and bridges. This is actually the updated list of environmental critical projects as of 2014. I actually searched as to 2011. There are no additional on the list. But during my time, when I was in college, golf courses are actually not part of the environmental critical projects. It was not part of a project that would require an ECC. But later on, I think I found out about this when I was doing my PhD somewhere 2016, that golf courses are already part of the category A or environmental critical projects. So these are the four major environmental critical projects that is under category A and will definitely require an ECC. The next category is category B, which is the environmental critical areas. So what are these areas? First area is areas declared by law as in national parks, watershed, reserves, wildlife preserve, and sanctuaries. There are actually cases what I'd say what leaders do. For example, I did not verify this, and I have not read any legal basis or any documents that would say that this is true or not. I'm not sure, but I heard this before. Yeah, like there is an area in North Tacloban that was proposed to be converted into a sanitary landfill or a dump site, open dump site, I think. And then that area is near a water system. I think it was near a falls or a river. And then what our city mayor did is he applied, I think he applied for that area to be considered as a watershed reserve for that area not to be converted in any way, because you can actually do projects. You can still do projects, or you can build something or whatever in a national park or watershed reserves. However, you have to secure an ECC. But if your project is located on these areas, definitely it will be hard for you to get an ECC. At the same time, we actually have a law when if the area is considered as a national park or watershed reserves, you cannot actually do any, or you can do projects, but if you will say like how huge is a project should be, I am not quite sure, but as far as I know, if it's a national park, it's a watershed reserves, you cannot do any major projects that would affect the ecosystem in one way or another. So basically, it's like saying you cannot do any projects in that specific areas, in that specific kind of areas. So the next environmental critical area are areas set aside as aesthetic potential tourist spots. So if it's a tourist spot, definitely you have to secure an ECC. If you are going to put a hotel or any kind of structure in that specific area, you have to secure an ECC. Next is areas with constitute the habitat for an endangered or threatened species of indigenous Philippine wildlife, both for flora and fauna. For example, are you familiar with the Lake Danao National Park? So it's a national park, and there has been a few studies on that national park that there are species of plants and animals, flora and fauna that are endemic to this specific area, in which basically you cannot, based on the EIS system, you can do a project, but you have to apply an ECC. But again, it will be hard for you to have a huge project in this kind of area. It's the same thing with Mount Apo. As far as I know, there are only limited people who can hike and climb Mount Apo in a specific time, because they want to protect the Mount Apo, of course, the ecosystem of Mount Apo, and they also have to make sure that the carrying capacity of Mount Apo in handling tourists and hikers, that the Mount Apo can sustain. So at the same time, if you are going to have a huge project, a major project in Mount Apo, definitely you will be needing an ECC, because there are a lot of studies already that there are still species of plants in Mount Apo that is unnamed yet or undiscovered. So yeah, you have to, definitely it will be part of the environmental critical areas. Next is areas of unique historic and archaeological, geological, or scientific interest. I would say a good example of this would be the Benham rice. I'm not sure if you've heard about that, but Benham rice is located in somewhere West Philippines. No, not west, but east. It's on the east of the Philippines. It's near the Pacific Ocean, and it is actually considered as the highest mountain under the ocean, as far as I know. I hope I got it right, because one of the principal scientists of the specific project is actually my professor in UP. But anyhow, since it has a unique, or it has a scientific interest, it belongs to the scientific interest, an area with a high scientific interest. So therefore, any project that will be done in the Benham rice will definitely needs an ECC. So next is areas with traditionally occupied by cultural communities of tribes. So these are the areas that you can still find indigenous people that are living. So if you will be making a project that in these areas, then therefore you have to secure an ECC. Another is areas frequently visited and or hard hit by natural calamity. So for example, areas that are frequently visited by typhoons, or areas that falls in the national Philippine fault line. Any places that are frequently hit by natural calamities, you have to secure an ECC. Next is areas with critical slopes. If it's because of course we all know that, if you are going to make a project in critical areas and critical slopes, you will be needing engineers know about this. You have to secure your foundation and all other things that you have to secure, and definitely there is a tendency that you will have an impact to the ecosystem or to the area itself. It's if the slope is high enough, so therefore you have to secure an ECC. Next is areas classified as prime agriculture lands. I know you might think that there are actually a lot of um, people or private landowners that are converting their prime agricultural lands into a different kind of land use. Like most of them, basically, especially if it's near an urban area, they are converting it into residential areas. So definitely, if you will be doing that, therefore, you need to secure an ECC. Next is recharge areas of aquifers. There are a lot of cases actually, even in our city, that swamps, wetlands, and other aquifers are being reclaimed and being converted into another kind of land use. And I'm not sure if they secured an ECC with that, but definitely an ECC is needed to have or to do a kind of project in this kind of areas. Of course, water bodies, any kind of water bodies, may it be river, lake, and other kind of water bodies. If you are going to do a project on that, definitely you will have to secure an ECC. Next is mangrove areas. Though there are actually a lot of mangrove areas that I've observed in our province, that they are actually um, cutting these mangrove areas and converting it into a hotels or resort. I'm not quite sure if they secure an ECC for that, but definitely if it's in a mangrove area, definitely you will have to secure an ECC. And of course, coral reefs. As we all know, coral reefs are um, very important ecosystem as a shelter for, as a habitat for our fishes and other marine organisms. Before in my college, the coral reefs are actually not, as far as I know, coral reefs and mangrove areas are not part of the environmental critical areas. Because I can remember when I was in college, I used to memorize all this environmental critical project and environmental critical areas because my professor before would usually ask this during exams. So as far as I can remember, mangrove areas and coral reefs are not part of the list. But based on the updated list from EMB, year 2014, it is now part of the environmental critical areas. So how can we secure an ECC? As as you know, I already shared this to you, the revised procedural manual, in which I am assuming that you already scanned through the DAO 30 2003, in which the EIA process and all informations that you need with the EIA system or for securing an ECC is actually on that manual. So what is the EIA process in the Philippines? So this is an overview of the EIA process in the Philippines. Of course, we have the screening. We have to check if the project is covered or not covered by the EIA system. So of course, the output is the checking list. And next, we have our scoping. So what are the most significant issues or impact of the project? And of course, the baseline information to be gathered. And the output is a signed scoping checklist. And then we have the EIA study and report preparation. So the EIA study contains the outline in the procedural manual, in which the output is the EIA report. And then the EIA report review and evaluation. So we will be submitting the EIA report to the EMB. Of course, review of EIA report by EMB and EIA review committee, in which the output is a review process report and draft decision document. And then, of course, next to that is the decision making, evaluation of draft decision document by endorsing and deciding authorities, in which the output is issuance of ECC. It's either CNC or denial letter. CNC is, oh my gosh, I forgot. Certificate of CNC is certificate non-compliance or denial letter. Am I right? Non-compliance. There is actually another letter that is given by DNR that would say that the project is not part, or it's under the category 4, category D. I think it's part of my slides later, but I think since CNC is certificate of none or DNA or the denial letter, I think that's it. Okay, and then after that, the decision making, of course, the monitoring, validation, and evaluation audit. So, assessment of performance of proponent against the ECC and its component in DMP and MAOP, which is the output, is the monitoring and audit report. So, after the EMB issued you an ECC, it doesn't end there, actually. They have to do a monitoring and audit of the project. It actually depends on the EMB's decision as to how many times they are going to do the monitoring. They can do it, depends on them, depends on the project, actually. They can do it monthly, quarterly, once a year. It depends on their decision, in which actually that is being indicated in the ECC or CNC or denial letter. In which this is the screening process based on the 4 categories. So we have category A, environmental critical projects, category B, projects in environmental critical areas. C is environmental enhancement or direct mitigation. And of course, the category D means not covered by the, it means there is no major impacts, or this or your project does not belong to any categories, and it has no it would not render any implicable impacts to the environment. So category A, of course, we have to check, we have to screen if it's new or existing. If it's new, so you have to screen if it's a single project, so therefore you have to prepare an EIS. If it's co-located project, then therefore you have to prepare an PEIS. If it's existing, you have to prepare a single project or EPRMP. If it's co-located, so when you say co-located, there is already an existing project. However, you will be having the same project on another area. So that's why it's called as co-located project. Therefore, you have to prepare PEPRMP. If it's under category B, which is projects in environmental critical areas, if it's new, therefore, if it's new and it's a single project, you have to prepare EIS or IEEC. If it's co-located, then therefore you have to prepare PEIS. If it's existing, if it's an existing project, if it's a single project, you have to prepare EPRMP. If it's co-located, then therefore you have to prepare PEPRMP. If it's project C, which is environmental enhancement or direct mitigation, if it's a single project, you only have to prepare a project description. If it's co-located, then you have to prepare only project description. If it's category B, it's a category D, which is not covered. You only have to prepare project description. So after the screening, you know now as to what category, as to what document to prepare. So next is you have to go to do the scoping. So public scoping, this would actually involve stakeholders in host municipalities. And then technical scoping meeting, which is with DNRMB and the EIA review committee. And then after these 2 activities, you have to sign a scoping checklist, in which it's actually termed as terms of reference of EIA, in which relevant issues to be included in the EIA report. So this is the time in which the stakeholders will be posting or will be signifying or will be stating as to their issues with the project that you have. This is actually very essential if the stakeholders will agree or will not agree with your project. Because if they will not agree, then therefore the DNREMB might give you an assessment of the scoping as to they will actually help you. You can actually do a second public scoping or you can do a third public scoping, and the DNR-EMB and the EIA review committee will will help you at some point as to how to um, how to I don't want to use attack, but how to strategize with your public scoping. So there are cases that public scoping might take a few public scoping, because the stakeholders will be laying out their problems and issues, and then therefore you have to also lay out and lay down as to what will be the mitigating measures with their issues and concern. Yeah. So with the EIA study and report preparation, there are actually page limits. So for example, for EIS, 250 pages, PEIS, 350 pages, EPRMP, only 150 pages. PERMP is only like 200 pages. IER, 75, and PDR, or the public description, which is basically 30 pages. So this slide is actually very helpful for me, especially when I took my comprehensive exam during my PhD. This actually easily guides me as to what kind of document will I be preparing in a specific type of project. So for category 1, which is environmental critical project, new and co-located, so I have to prepare PEIS, or programmatic environmental impact statement, in which the processing or endorsement is by EMB director, and the deciding authority is, of course, the DNR secretary, and the maximum time frame is 180 days. 180 days is like 6 months. Next type of project is still environmental critical project. It's new and single project. So the one that I will be preparing is, or the one that is a requirement, is an environmental impact statement, or EIS. Of course, it has the same processing and endorsing, deciding authority, and the maximum time frame is 120 days. That is 4 months. 4 months. Next is still category A, existing, to be expanded, and if it is co-located, then therefore I have to prepare programmatic environmental performance report and management plan. It's the same processing, endorsing, and the maximum time frame is 4 months. The same with operating without ECC, which is a co-located project. Talking about this now, this is actually a slap on my face and to our faces, because as far as I know, I'm not sure with this, but on my opinion and on my own knowledge, as far as I know, there's actually no ECC. Given that we have a lot of buildings and it has been built way back, like we are already approached more than 100 years, and we actually don't have an ECC. And given that we can actually say, like, created way back before the EAS system, we can say that, sure. But we actually have new buildings. I don't know if you've been, but for sure you've been there, and I think you can also, you can observe that we have few buildings. Sadly, those building has no ECC, as far as I know, because if there is an ECC, definitely they have to put a tarpaulin with the ECC certificate number. I know about this because I think there was an issue before, because I went to the and saw a lot of electronic waste, and then it was a huge dump of electronic waste, and was startled and amazed as to where did this electronic waste came from. And then from that problem, she started looking at documents that relates to, and actually she was lenient enough to be considerate. And then from that certain point, I think it was found out that no ECC, even on its new buildings. Given that there are actually licensed environmental planner, I myself is knowledgeable enough with the EIA, and then how come, and we have also a lot of that are knowledgeable on this and know how to prepare an EIA. But yeah, that was the question, in which how come we are teaching EIA in some of the buildings per se, new projects, new buildings has no ECC, and it was yeah. Anyhow, so those building actually belongs on this category, operating without ECC, and yeah. So on that certain case, therefore, the document that has to be prepared is a programmatic environmental performance report and management plan. Of course, the same processing and endorsement and deciding authority, and would take at least 4 months for the ECC to be issued. Next is existing to be expanded, single project, or operating without ECC and a single project. So the requirement to that is environmental performance report and management plan, same processing and endorsing, and same deciding authority, which is the MB director or CO director. And the processing time is a maximum of 3 months. Next is a single new project, which is B1. The required document is initial environmental examination or initial environmental examination checklist. So the processing on endorsing is the EMB CEO or the EIA division chief. And of course, the deciding authority is the EMB CO director. So there's actually no maximum time frame to this, because because it might only take like a few weeks in issuing an ECC. The EIA report preparers, these are actually a group of people and is not being done only by a single person. Because as what we have discussed last meeting, and I think for sure you already scanned through our to the DAO, DAO 3003, that the EIA preparer is actually composed of experts from it could be local experts only, it could be local and international consultants, and it may have 5 to 34 members. And again, the AA preparer or the group preparer or the group itself does not contain only one person. So you can actually have consulting firms, which is 80% of the sample EAS were prepared by them. But the two EIA study that I sent you, which focus on buildings, those were actually done by EIA students. And then 15 registered firms for EIA preparation as of 2016. And the team of individual EIA preparers. As of now, in the Philippines, there are 316 registered individual EIA preparers as of 2016. So as you can see, the members of the AA preparer team should be an expert to the different ecosystem state. For example, a member should be an expert on the land. So he or she could be a geologist, a mining engineer, terrestrial flora and fauna specialist, or a wildlife specialist. The next should be an expert with water. So he or she could be an aquatic biota specialist, hydrologist, marine biologist, water quality specialist. Next member should be expert with air. So should be expert with air quality and noise specialist. Next could be a social scientist, or he or she should be an expert with people. So he or she could be a sociologist, socioeconomic specialist, or community development officer or community development. All right. So, and of course, if ERA is required, when you say ARA, it means environmental risk assessment. So therefore, you will be needing an ERA specialist or an EHIA specialist. HIA specialist means environmental health impact assessment specialist. So let me give you a quick example of a copper mine project. Let me give you a quick example of an EIA study which focused on a copper gold mine project. This is actually in the Philippines. This is in Kiblawan, Davao Sur. It actually has a lot of area. Kudarat, Manglao, Sarangani, and Talapacan, South Cotabato. So the area is 9,605 hectares. Capital cost is 250 billion peso. Mine life in years is 20 years. And then production capacity is 160 metric tons per year of I'm not sure if it's gold, because that would be a lot. I'm not sure if this is specifically gold or is it the amount of soil or mineral that they will be extracting. And then the nature of project is resource extractive, or which is under the mining and processing. So prescribed outline of the EIA report or the EAS. Of course, the preliminary, they have the project fact sheet, they have the table of contents, the executive summary, the main EAS, which is the project, basic project information, description of projects, EIA process, project description, based on information conditions, impact assessment and mitigation, environmental risk assessment, environmental management plan, bibliography, and annexes. So this is their description. I will just scan through it. Just to give you an example, this is their baseline information conditions impact assessment. So they have, they classified as to what parts of the ecosystem that will have an impact, that will be impacted by their project. So the land, they have the water, the air, and the people. And then this is the land. So they have 3 impacts: change in land use, encroachment and disturbance of the ECAs, and loss of topsoil. And then they have phases of pre-construction, construction, operational, and closure, operation and closure. And of course, they have options for mitigation or enhancement. So as you can see, in every impact, it is being considered on all the phase, not only during the operation but up to the closure. And then all these impacts are being addressed in their mitigation or enhancement activity. Potential impacts with geology, geomorphology, and geohazards and impacts. So they also classified those, and they also have a specific mitigation or enhancement. So the same with tailing waste and rock waste. Also with terrestrial vegetation, so they identified 8 impacts with that, and of course they also have a corresponding mitigation or enhancement activity to minimize that specific impact. They also have they also classified 4 impacts to terrestrial wildlife, and of course also with water, hydrology, and hydrogeology and impacts. They also have an impact with water and sediment quality, which is one of the huge impacts when it comes to mining, the hydrology, water and sediment quality. They also qualified 10 impacts with the open pit, since the type of mining, the procedural mining that they will be doing is open pit. They also have freshwater ecology, in which they also identify 5 impacts. Of course, with climate, they identified 2 impacts with a corresponding mitigation and enhancement. Of course, the air quality, which is on fugitive dust and noise when they do their operation. And of course, they also have a activities for mitigation or enhancement. Of course, for the people, so they have displacement, they have in-migration, because there will be people who will be working in the mining company that came from other provinces or other municipalities. And of course, cultural or lifestyle change in the IPs, if IPs are being considered, or if IPs are living on the area that they are doing the project. But basically, since it's in Sultan Kudarat and mostly on the southern part of the Philippines, Most basically, there are IPs that are still living in these areas. And then they have an environmental management plan. They have social development framework. They have IAC framework. They have emergency responses policy and generic guidance. They also have abandonment, decommission, rehabilitation policies and guidelines. So they actually have, they will be lining up in this specific guidelines as to what will be their activities during the abandonment and decommissioning of the project. Again, as we, since there were a lot of questions last meeting about this when it comes to mining, as I said earlier, when they secure their ECC, all phases of the project are indicated in the ECC. The problem is the mining company or the specific company that is doing the project, they do not do what has been indicated in their EIA or what has been indicated in their ECC, especially during the abandonment and decommissioning of the project. Of course, they have environmental monitoring plan, which will be tackled next, and they have the institutional plan for EMP implementation. So, of course, starting up, in this chapter, we will discuss how EIA is carried out. It actually provides the step-by-step approach to the EIA as practiced in the US and in the Philippines. I don't know if you have observed even once. I don't know if you observed, but the way I see it, basically all the Philippine law is actually being patterned with the US law, like Clean Air Act and Water Act and all those Republic Acts. Not all, basically not all, of course, but basically most are patterned with the US law, in which it's also the same with the EIA system. Basically, our EIA system is patterned with the US. So, of course, it covers the early stages of the EIA process. And this includes the clarification of whether an EIA is required at all, which specifically on the screening part or screening phase of the EIA process, and an outline of the extent of the EIA. So the question is the project screening really needed in the EIA? This is actually very important because there are a number of projects that could be subject to EIA is potentially very large. Yet, if we're going to look back on the environmental critical projects and environmental critical areas, even if, for example, the environmental critical project, it has 4 categories. Actually, the 5th one is the golf courses. But if we're going to look at the resource extraction, there are actually a lot of projects that is under that category. And, you know, it's the EIA can actually embrace all these projects, and it's very large. Yet, if we are going to scrutinize each project, there are actually many projects that has no substantial environmental impact. In which that is why we have category C and category D. To this, screening focus on those projects with potentially significant environmentally impacts or where impacts are not fully known. So there are steps. These are the steps that are involved in the EIA assessment. So first is, of course, the project screening. I know I already mentioned this. Project screening, scoping, description of the project, description of the environmental baseline, identification of key impacts, prediction of the impacts, of course, evaluation and assessment of significance of these impacts, the environmental management plan, in which we will be stating in that plan and how can we mitigate these impacts or these activities. Of course, the EIS preparation, the EIS review, which is done by the DNR-AMB, and the decision making, and of course, the post-decision monitoring and audit. So, I know this has been mentioned. I will just run through this. That again, in our DAO 30-2003, the implementing rules and regulation for the Philippine Environmental Impact Statement System. With the section 4, we have category A, B, C, and D. So when we say A, it's ECP, Environmental Critical Projects. B means ECAs, or Environmental Critical Areas. Category C, which is project intended to enhance environmental quality or address existing environmental problems not falling under category A and B. And of course, the category D, which is projects unlikely to cause adverse environmental impacts. And of course, we also have the proponents, in which we discussed actually on the previous slides on the first presentation we had today. So these are again the requirements that we'll be needing. For example, for category A and B, definitely we have to secure an ECC. For co-located projects, so we have to secure an ECC. For eco zones, of course, we have to secure an ECC. For projects under category C or environmental projects are required to submit only project description. And also with project D, that may secure for certificate of non-coverage or non-CEC. So I take it back. It's not CNC does not mean certificate of non-compliance, but certificate of non-coverage. It means that your project is not under category A, B, and C, and it does not or would not give an adverse impacts to the environment with any specific activity that pertains to your project. So this is the flow chart of the EIA process in the Philippines. So of course we have to inform the DNR regulatory board as to what kind of project that we are doing. Of course, we have the screening committee. The screening committee will check if it's under environmental critical project or if it is under environmental critical areas. If it is under environmental critical area, therefore you will be needing an IIE, and of course you will be needing or you will have to secure an ECC. If it's an environmental critical project, you have to undergo EIA. The same with ECA. After IEE, you have to undergo EIA study. And then after the EIA study, you have to secure or prepare the EIS document and submit it to EMB. And then the EIA review committee will review your submission, your EIS study. And of course, they will do a site visit and then a public hearing and the EIS evaluation. And then after that, the EIA review committee will have a recommendation. Of course, this will be reviewed by the AMB regional director. So therefore, they will be deciding if they will issue you an ECC or they will deny your ECC application. If we will go back here to the screening committee, if your project is exempted, therefore your project belongs to category D, which does not belong to project A, category A, B, and C. Therefore, your project is non-coverage of the different categories. Therefore, you will be exempted and you will be issued with certificate of non-coverage. So this is the flow chart on how to apply for the ECC. So for the scoping, so I know in our project, we will not be doing a public scoping, right? Because of course we cannot do that with what's happening right now. But of course, as I told everyone, you have to put an assumptions. Of course, for sure, the stakeholders will have an issue for us in building the ABSU College of Medicine in Babatngon. For sure, they will have an issue to that. Maybe they might have an issue with the waste disposal, or and other issues that might occur. So it does not. I know for sure. I know in some case you will say that, oh, we will assume that there is no issue coming from the stakeholders. Of course, that's impossible. There is always an issue coming from the stakeholders. So you have to put that as an assumption. You have to include that as part of your assumption. So with the EIA scoping, we have to identify the issues and impacts to consider. For example, delineation of the spatial and temporal boundaries of the study. Identification of the study area. If would the area have a direct or primary impact because of the study, or the area would only have an indirect or secondary impact. So when we say direct or primary impact, it actually refers So when we say direct or primary impact area, it actually refers to specific areas where the project or facilities or infrastructure will be located or traverse, such as buildings, irrigation, drainage, quarry sites, and access roads. So these are areas where there will be displacement of settlements or livelihood. Areas directly vulnerable to flooding or inundation that may caused by the project. It's also in areas along with main tributary downstream or river system, which will be the receiver of waste discharges. Areas where there will be disturbance of habitat of endangered species, catchment area of river system or watersheds, or ancestral domain of indigenous communities that may be affected by the project. When we say indirect or secondary impact area, this refers to influence area of the project which could be indirectly affected by the proposed development. This could include areas in the vicinity of the direct impacts area, such as communities or settlements outside the direct impact area, which can also be benefited by the employment opportunities related by the project. Another example of the indirect area is a sub-tributaries of the river system, which can be indirectly affected by pollution. Areas where water sources will be indirectly affected by pollution, and areas where water sources will be indirectly affected by drawdown in the direct impact area. So what are the advantages of scoping? So of course, the avoidance of work. All right, so what are the advantages of scoping? First is avoidance of work and data overlaps, because by scoping we will know as to what are the documents that will be needed, what type of as to what our project belongs to, what category. At the same time, we can already plan ahead as to what will be the activities that we have to do in relation to the EAS preparation. Second is prioritize and coordinated data sourcing and baseline studies. We will also be able to identify as to what baseline studies are needed to the project that we will be doing. Of course, minimize possibility of overlooking important issues or project alternatives. So there are cases like you are pursuing for this specific kind of project. However, as you did your scoping, you found out that there is a better alternative project that you can do than the project that you are proposing. And of course, enhance chances of gaining acceptability of the project. So during the scoping, you will be hearing statements from the stakeholders as to their issues, in which to that, if they will not agree to your project during that time, therefore you can do another second round of public scoping, in which on that specific scoping, you will be addressing their concerns. And then to that, if their concerns will be addressed, then there is a possibility that they will be accepting your project. So EIA impact identification. So what will happen as a result on the project? So of course, it brings together project characteristics and baseline characteristics, which aim of ensuring that all potentially significant impacts, may it be adverse or favorable, are identified and taken into accounts in the EIA. That is why the impact prediction, in which that is actually the next lesson, but I'm not sure if I can discuss it to you today. But the impact identification is very important, because this will be the main meat of your EIA study. If you will not be able to identify all the impacts, all the adverse impacts or high risk impacts of your project, there is a huge possibility that your application will be denied. And if your application will be denied, then that will be hard, because you have to maybe you can redo your EIA study, or you can add up as to what are the missing impacts that you were not able to identify in your EIS study. And then of course, characterize project activities from cradle to grave. So when you say cradle to grave, from the moment it was not created yet up to its let us say decommissioning or abandonment phase. So from pre-construction to construction to operational to the decommissioning or abandonment phase. So we have to consider that with the impact identification. And then characterize baseline data to describe the initial environment. Because of course it will be hard to predict the impact if we do not know exactly what is the initial environmental status of the area that we will be doing our project, in which again that is why the baseline data is very important with your EIS study, because it will be the reference point of your impacts, of your impact predictions. At the same time, there is actually no such thing as EIA study or EIS document that has no baseline studies or information, because again, that is the reference point. At the same time, during the monitoring and audit, of course, whatever will be the adverse effects or whatever will be the adverse impact of your project, and then the result of that monitoring and audit, their reference for that impact will be based on your baseline information or the initial status of the environment. All right. Also, the importance of impact identification is to compile a candidate list of key impacts and identify all potential primary, secondary, and cumulative impacts of the project. So, in which later I will show you, I think I have it here, an example of this impact identification. Also, it will be very useful in identifying key issues and concern, and of course, identify potential impacts or impact prediction per se. So we actually have, this is actually the methods of impact identification. So of course, first is the checklist. All right, so the methods of impact identification is, okay, so I hope that's better. I hope you can, I hope you can see I think you can see my slides already. So we have impacts of, this is the methods of impact identification. Of course, we have the checklist, the matrices, networks, overlays, and of course, we can also using models. As to the good thing with models is we can actually model and we can actually see the impacts of the study. And at the same time, we can also consider the sensitivity analysis of the situation or for the project or for the specific impact that we want to model from your project. So this is an example of a checklist. This is an example of a checklist. So this is, for example, wildlife. We have A, B, C, D, up to J. So for example, A means no effect, B means positive effect, C means negative effect, D beneficial, E adverse, and so on and so forth. And then this is the matrix table showing project activities range over ecosystem components. For example, we have wind circulation under the air or under the physical. We will check if 1, 2, 3, 4 actually is a number of the actions. So for example, wind circulation, we can do, we will be doing that during the pre-construction. So we have to put a check to that. On my case, I'll put X. During the construction, are we going to do a wind circulation assessment? So this is an example of a matrix table with a corresponding environmental components or conditions. So we have physical, earlier we have air, we have water, and then we have land and soil. We also have, for example, biological. So we have land plants, we have land animals, and we have aquatic plants, in which basically when you say biological, this would actually focus on species composition, population density. This is more of the diversity of when it comes to biological flora and fauna. And then, of course, we also have social environment. So for example, population characteristics. Is there a population change? Is there a possible ethnic or racial distribution? relocated population, influx or outflows of temporal and seasonal residents. We also have community and institutional structures. For example, is there a voluntary associations? Will there be an interest group activity? Size of structure of the government, and so on and so forth. So we can identify those as part of the impact of your project on the specific activities or phases of your project. All right. This is actually this illustration actually is an illustration of a certain lake pollution and how could this lake pollution be affected by a lot of components. For example, um, for example, lake pollution is being contributed by it's actually a lot of going on here. For example, it is being contributed by the fish pen technology, in which fish pen technology there is an artificial feeding, and this artificial feeding can actually increase nitrogen and phosphorus, and at the same time, it can cause eutrophication, algal bloom, and can cause fish kill. At the same time, if there will be a fish kill, of course, it will affect the lake. It will affect to the lake pollution, or it can contribute to the lake pollution. At the same time, the increase of nitrogen and phosphorus because of the artificial feeding can also affect or can also contribute to the lake pollution. Anyhow, my point in this illustration is there are a lot of factors that can influence the pollution of a certain lake, and there are also a lot of factors that can affect and that can cause a certain pollution of a certain lake, in which therefore this can actually represent your specific study or specific project. So whatever project, as I mentioned on last meeting, whatever project, whatever progress, whatever kind of development, there is always an impact. There is no such thing as zero impact, because as what we all know, when we produce something, when we create something, there is always a byproduct, and to that specific byproduct, pollution is one of that. And pollution, as we all know, is a kind of an impact to the environment that could risk human health and the health of the ecosystem itself. Okay, so let's go now to the baseline categories. So the baseline categories should have a physical, biological, social, economic, and political. As you can remember, I actually explained this last meeting to the and you still remember the illustration with octagons. Was it octagons? Heptagon, or was it an heptagon, in which the ecosystem tends to have these different components. So the physical, biological, social, economic, and political. We also have actually the cultural, as I can remember. So in which with the physical, of course, it will involve the air. So this is actually belongs to the attribute of the environment. So we can have the diffusion factor, the atmospheric stability, mixing depth, wind speed, precipitation, humidity, topography. We can also have the particulate matter, which is the 24-hour arithmetic mean concentration. We also have on air our sulfur oxide. What is the concentration of our sulfur oxide, and as expressed in 24-hour. We also have hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons is a 24-hour average and not 24 hours. And of course, we also have our nitrogen oxide, which is the average annual concentration in the ambient air. Just a few weeks ago, I've read a report from EMB that the air quality in Tacloban City is actually on a good level. So, in which that means our ambient air in Tacloban City is not yet polluted, and that's very good. Of course, under air, again, we have carbon monoxide, photochemical oxidants, hazardous toxicants, others. So those are the main pollutants in our air. Let's go now to the water. So we have surface water and groundwater. So watershed hydrology, we have to include stream flow discharge measurements, lake inflow, and a lot of parameters actually under the surface water. With the groundwater, this is more of the reservoir. So we have to characterize the aquifer, including water level measurement, the flow direction, if the flow direction is being affected by the project, the field water yield, aquifer transmissivity, porosity, and permeability. So at the same time, if we want to know the groundwater quality, there are also other parameters that we can do. For example, we can do hardness, conductivity, alkalinity, presence of trace elements, metal trace elements, toxicants, and of course, the bacteria or the microorganisms that is present on our water. Of course, the land, we have to include landform and land suitability. We also have land use patterns as to what is the current land use pattern of the project, of the area where your project will be located. Of course, we also have to consider preserves and natural areas. Sound, of course, sources and sound levels, and which actually attributes with loudness, frequency, and duration. Ambient sound levels like background noise levels at sensitive receptor points potentially affected by projects should be measured. Next is, of course, with the ecology, both biotic and abiotic. Of course, the most important is the vegetation. We also have terrestrial habitats, freshwater habitats, and marine habitats. We also have to include if our area are located in a water body. Of course, we have to include terrestrial water body. We have to include freshwater aquatic animals, marine animals, and of course the unique and threatened endangered species. So these are the species we have to study. We have to include its species distribution, population, and habitat requirements. So when we say if it's under the ecology, which is biotic and abiotic relationships, especially on abiotic, on flora and fauna, it would always require a diversity indices. So Shannon Diversity Index, species, endemism rate, population density. So these are the few parameters that are always included when it comes to ecology. Ecology, the attribute of the ecological attribute in the environment. Of course, we have to consider also the human dimension. So, of course, the social structure, social attitudes and beliefs, the political structure, population and demographics, ethnic structures, and public services. For example, schools, police, fire, water, wastewater, road, solid, hazardous, and waste disposal. Because there are also cases that that the project is very beneficial to the community. For example, for the EVSU College of Medicine, if you, of course, if it's a College of Medicine and we are offering medicine, of course, actually the hospital that the partnered hospital is actually EVRMC, but of course, all the practicums and all the laboratory classes cannot be done in the EVRMC. So therefore, the building itself, the College of Medicine building itself, will have this kind of facilities, in which therefore, during emergencies, between life and death and certain emergencies, and the community will be needing an assistance for a certain accident, it might be beneficial for them if the College of Medicine will be located in their area, in which that will be one of the things that we will be one of the things that that will gain the approval from the community or from the stakeholders. All right, let's go now to the pointers for baseline studies. So pointers for baseline studies. Of course, the list of data requirements, the requirements that you will be needing. Of course, collect and review secondary data before collecting primary data. So there will be no overlapping of work. And of course, for you not to waste your time in collecting the primary data if you already have the secondary data. Of course, identifying the data gaps for you to know what are these data that you need to acquire for your baseline studies. And of course, validate secondary data. Because even if there's already a data, of course, you still have to validate that. And of course, design a system of primary data collection. So if you will be doing, for example, for water, what parameters will you be using? Are you going for total solids? Are you going for total hardness? Or are you going for turbidity only? So how are you going to design the system of primary data collection? The contents of your baseline study plan should have the purpose and the need of the project. That's very important because, again, what's the use of having your project if you will not be able to identify what is the purpose and why do we need to do the project that you are proposing. Of course, this conceptual project plan and schedule, the environmental setting, the scope of EIA, and of course the key issues and concerns that was pre-identified already, identification of data needs, and the evaluation of existing data and sustainability. And then, of course, we have to prepare our baseline study plans because we have to ensure that relevant data are being collected. Because there might be data that are not really relevant, but we gave our time and efforts to gather this data. Of course, we have to establish the current state of the environment, which is the very important part of your EIA study because it will be the reference point. If there is an adverse impact that was during the monitoring and audit, they can compare that results to your baseline data or to your baseline study. Of course, we have to estimate data collection costs. Of course, we cannot pour out our fund just by doing our baseline study plan. So we have to estimate that. And then estimate project schedule. So of course, by doing your baseline study plans, you will have your Gantt chart. The Gantt chart is actually just a table in which you will be having, or you will lay down the activities that you will be doing with the corresponding date or corresponding months. And of course, ensure early consideration of project options. So, as what I showed you on last meeting, on how we impacts examined by EIA, there were actually like 8 components, but on this graph, on this illustration, I'm showing only 4, which is usually the 4 components of the ecosystem that is usually being impacted by certain projects. So of course, we have to consider the human health impacts, the socio-economic impacts, the biophysical impacts, and the geophysical impacts. Usually on a lot of EIA studies, these are usually the 4 components. They do not, there are only few studies or EIA studies that would have an adverse impact on political environment. Also, there are studies that has an impact on the cultural environment, but they actually put the cultural under the socio-economic impacts. They embed the cultural environment to the socio-economic impacts. So basically, these are the 4 components that is being that has an adverse impact or that is being impacted by a certain project. So of course, again, the data source could be primary sources and secondary sources. But then again, as I told everyone with your EIA study, everything will be based on assumptions. But there are part of the EIS system that should not be that will not be that will not be an assumption, I should say. So for example, the location. So for this afternoon, we will be discussing the continuation of Unit 2, which is the methodological aspects of EIA, focusing on impact prediction. So of course, first, what is impact prediction? All right, so impact prediction, its main objective is to identify the magnitude, or let us say, what is the veracity of the impact of the project or activity that you will be doing in your specific project or specific area. And of course, the other dimensions of an effect or change in an environment with a project or action in comparison with the situation without the project or the action or the activity itself. That is why, again, baseline information is very important as a reference point in your EIA study. So prediction involves the identification of potential change and indicator of such environmental receptors. in which at the same time, prediction establishes the cause. How come my it's not moving? All right. So prediction, of course, establishes the cause-effect relationship between project action and environmental components. That is why we always try to think and predict as to what is the future impact or what will be the impact of our project or our study. And at the same time, we have to think as our project or activity as the cause and its possible effect. May it be in the future after 5 or 10 years, or may it be a direct effect after the study or after the project has been established. At the same time, predictions also provide the basis for the assessment of significance of impact. Because as what we discussed on the previous meetings, there are impacts that are not really significant, or let us say, it's how do you call this? It could be, I should say, neglected because its impact is not that adverse or its impact is minimal, in which these indicators need to be disaggregated and specified to provide variables that are measurable and relevant. So, for example, for economic impact, we have to check the direct employment that would relate to local employment, and of course, local skilled employment, whatever it is, this let us say, what I would say, for example, specific example, you will be building in our case, we will be building the EBSU College of Medicine, for example. Of course, as we are, let us say, EIA study, let us say we are still doing the EIA study. Of course, we will consider the construction of the building per se. Of course, in one way or another, we will, well, it actually depends on the contractor, but basically, in one way or another, we can have a direct impact on the employment. May it be the contractors will hire construction workers that are living near the area, or they may not. It actually depends on, realistically, it depends on the contractor. But let us say, in one way or another, let us put an assumption that the contractor will be hiring people that are living near the area, construction workers that are living in the area. So that is considered as a direct employment. And then at the same, and the next point is, it is also considered as a local employment because the establishment of the project is on the locality, and the construction workers that were hired are also people that are living on the locality. And at the same time, they are also considered as local skilled employment because they were hired specifically on the basis of their skill. So that's an example of an impact prediction, specifically on economic impact. Predictions should also identify distinction between magnitude and significance of impact, in which when we say magnitude and significance, it's more of a change may be high but below the standards. That is why during the EIA study, there are predictions that we have to quantify as to what is the veracity of magnitude and its significance. For example, this might not relate directly to the EVSU building, but let us say you are going to build a dam. I take it back. Let us say you are going to build a building that you will be in housing your poultry business. So if we are going to read the Dow 30/2003, there is actually a standard on the quality of water. Let us say after 5 years, there has been an effect of your poultry business to the water quality of wells in the nearest barangay of wherever is your area is located. There has been a change of water quality, and people are identifying that the cause of it is actually your poultry business because of your wastewater, let us say. Um, based on your reference, based on your baseline information, on your water quality baseline information, you can say that there is a difference. There is a difference as to the water quality before the project started and after 5 years that your project started. So you identify that there is a change. However, though there was a change, and though let us say statistically it has a significant difference, okay, but based on the standards of water quality, it is still below the standards. Therefore, the water is still acceptable for, let us say, daily use. So that is why we have to define or distinct as to what could be or what will be the prediction or the impact prediction of our project. Because again, the effect or the impact might be high. However, it is still considered as below the standards. Therefore, it could still be accepted, or it is still on an acceptable level. And then prediction of magnitude impacts is objective. So when we say objective, there are bases. Whereas determination of significance is more of subjective exercises or exercise as it normally involves value judgments. That is why, just like my example to you, after 5 years of your Porte business, there was a significant difference on the water quality, which is your reference point is the baseline information of the water quality, and then your water quality after 5 years. There is a significant difference subjectively based on statistics. However, objectively based on the water quality standards, it is still below the standards. Therefore, the water is still acceptable for daily use. So again, magnitude of impacts is objective, that which is based on standards, and significance is more of subjective exercise. So other dimensions of predictions, we have geographical extent impacts. For example, we have local, provincial, and national. We also have beneficial or adverse, because there are impacts that are beneficial and there are impacts that are adverse. So it could negatively affect the community or the environment itself. At the same time, there are projects which is on the category 4. There are projects that would enhance the ecosystem, or it's an enhancement project that would contribute to a betterment of the ecosystem per se. So in which, therefore, that kind of project is beneficial. And its impact prediction is, of course, since it's category 4, should also be beneficial. Of course, we have to consider also duration of impacts. It could be short, it could be long. There could be impacts of a certain project or a certain activity that might not be experienced on, like, for example, after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th year, but on the succeeding like 6th to 10th year, that is the time that the impact will be experienced. Of course, the rate of change, it could be abrupt and gradual. So the changes, when we say abrupt, like suddenly everything changes. When we say gradual, it's like slowly and slowly there is a change, or slowly and slowly there is an impact of your project to a specific area or to that specific area. And then there are also effects or adverse impacts that are permanent and reversible. When we say permanent, permanent means permanent. There are possible cases that it can be reversed, but it would take time, or I would say it would take geologic time. And when we say reversible, there are impacts that we can still find ways to mitigate, or we can still find ways to rehabilitate. At the same time, there are also impact predictions that are cumulative. When we say cumulative, for example, what could be an specific example to cumulative? When we say cumulative, it adds up. So, for example, the impact of the project today is, let us say, going back to the example of poultry business impacting the water quality of the nearby barangay wells. When we say cumulative, like after 5 years, its effect is, let us say, the water quality was degraded for like about 20%. Let us say 20%. And then after 3 years, the water quality was degraded into an additional of 10%, in which after 6 years, um, the cumulative water quality degradation of water quality uh, resulted to 60%. Did I say 60%? So let us say 20 and then plus 20, that's 40%. And then another year, another 20%. So let us say on the 7th year, the water quality degradation rate resulted to 60%. So it's cumulative. It's an addition on top of another impact. So cumulative. I hope I explained that. Next is, of course, unit of measurement. Quantitative and qualitative. When we say quantitative, we are quantifying. When we say qualitative, it's more about on the quality. Like, for example, um, um, we will go to the social science aspect of the impact of the project. For example, we are going to ask people after 10 years as to what is the positive impact of the project. So we can ask them, since we are asking them, for example, through a survey questionnaire, and choices would be strongly, let us say, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, then that is considered as a qualitative unit of measurement. When we say quantitative, there is a specific quantity, for example, in parts per million. For example, for water quality, amount of nitrogen should be in percentage, and so on and so forth. When we say quantitative, it's in quantity, and there is a specific number to the certain unit of measurements. When we say estimates the probability that impacts will occur, then therefore we will be using a probability index, or we will be using we can use actually a statistical model to that, as to the probability index of a certain effect of not effect, I should use word impact. We can actually use a statistical model in predicting as to what is the probability that a certain impact will occur on a certain project, or on a certain from a certain project. Approaches to impact prediction. We have expert judgment, we have comparisons, on-site experiments, and mathematical model. So first, when we say expert judgment, this is based on experts' knowledge and experience. That is why when you make your EIA study, or if you've already read the example, the two examples that I gave you, two example EIA study that I gave you, as you read through, there is they actually stated the group, or the EIA preparer, or the EIA group, or the list of members who prepared the EIA study. Because it is actually very important to state the name of the members and their expertise. Though in your case, the members are mostly engineers per se, but basically, if the NRMB would be more confident if the EIA group correlates to the study or correlates to the type of project that they are submitting. So, for example, the EVSU College of Medicine, which is your EIA study, it would, if I can give a comment as to the members, or if I can select members, it would be better if there is a doctor of medicine that is part of your study, because it's a college of medicine. So that medical doctor can give insights as to, for example, the design of the building, what are the needed equipments, what are the classroom design and laboratory design. At the same time, I would also suggest in your group that there should also be, though engineers are, you have a good background in geology, so that's okay. There should be an environmental science specialist in your group. What else? There should be a risk assess. There is actually a specific term to that. A risk. I forgot the correct. I forgot the correct term to that specific person who are an expert on risk assessment. There's actually a specific term to them to that kind of specialist. But anyhow, again, one of the approaches to impact prediction are expert judgment based on experts' knowledge and experience. Next is, of course, comparison. This is more of comparing your EIA study with an existing development similar to that proposed study. That is why I gave you two examples of an EIA study, which is also almost the same project. However, the difference is, I think they propose a laboratory building and a gender something building. On your case, you are preparing for a College of Medicine building. So though those two buildings or three buildings tends to have a difference on the specialty or on the specialized building per se, but basically, it's almost the same project. It focuses on the construction of a building. So yes, that's one of the thing. Comparison approaches to impact prediction comparison. Next, of course, is on-site experiments. So experiments may be carried out on existing location or in laboratory. In your case, since it's a building, the best thing you can do is, of course, this is not. You are being discouraged to go to Babatngon and do a sightseeing or a site visit. But as you said, you already did it, so that's very good. But when we conduct in an EIA study which is on building construction, so on-site experiments might not be that much applicable per se, because it's a construction of a building. It's not unless you will have a prototype. I don't know how you call it in engineering or architecture. Is it a prototype or I don't know exactly what's the name. When architects, when they have a design, they build it in a miniature. I forget the name of that. Anyhow, on-site experiments are more of applicable on projects that I would say that its impact are not well known yet. So they have to conduct an on-site experiments. So at the same time, it also involves potential contaminants or characteristics of the proposed activity that may be reproduced on site and the effects directly monitored. So again, this is more of on-site experiments are more of applicable on a project that its impact are not well known yet, and that would involve contaminants or toxic chemicals per se. Yeah. Next approach is mathematical models. So representation may be carried out, representations between cause and effect in the form of one or more mathematical relationship. The two simplest model of example would be the population growth form, in which you can put a mathematical model on this. This is actually for example, your proposal is to build a condominium building in Tacloban City. So of course, you have to predict as to what will be the population of Tacloban City in after 5 to 10 years. Of course, for your study or for your condo for you to know if your project would be feasible or if it will be profitable after, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. So of course, one of the best way to check if there will be enough population that would be interested to buy, or that would be interested to get a unit from your condominium building, then this is one of the things that you can consider doing mathematical models. At the same time, you can also do mathematical models when it comes to, for example, you are doing a, for example, your proposed project is a mining activity in a specific area. So of course, before you do mining, you have to study first as to what is the quality of mineral that you will be extracting. Because if the quality of the mineral that you will be extracting would not be that good, then therefore your investment might not also be that good. So aside from, well, I am talking now as to not to the EIA preparation per se, but I am talking now as to how you can use mathematical models. As to how are you going to use mathematical models. So let us say you calculated as to you want to calculate as to how many months it would take you to extract a certain mineral on a specific area. So you can do a mathematical model of that. At the same time, you can also model as to for, let us per se, how many how much it would take you to extract. You can also model as to the volume of minerals that you can extract on a specific ore in comparison to their quality per se. So that's how you can use mathematical models. Representation between cause and effect in a form of one or more mathematical relationship. So let's go now to the methods of prediction, or how to predict. So there are many potential methods to predict impacts, and none provides a magic solution to the predicted problem, in which methods can be classified, but classifications are not mutually exclusive. So there is two types of methods according to the scope of impacts. So first method is the holistic approach, or holistic methods. However, holistic method is seldom used, because holistic approach specifically focuses on the primary environment. So it does not directly include the social and economic environment per se. It only considers the physical aspect. The environmental impact assessment solely focuses on the physical environment. So an example would be on human beings, fauna and flora, soil, water, air, climate, and landscape, material assets and cultural heritage, interaction between mentioned in the first, second, and third, and deaths. So as what I mentioned on the previous lectures, on our case, on our EIA study, we always consider almost all aspects that could be affected by the certain project or certain activity. So that is why in the Philippines, or actually not only the Philippines, but almost all throughout the whole world, that has an EIA system or EIS system, they usually use partial method or the most method per se. So it depends on the type of project, it depends on the type of impact, and it also depends on the extrapolative methods that is applicable to your specific project or specific activity. So when we say type of project, may it be on power heavy industry, infrastructure, transportation. When we say type of impact, does it focus on pollution, or does it focus on resource depletion, or does it focus on ecosystem disruption? In which we can specifically focus on a specific type of project or impact when we assess the scope of the impacts of a certain project or activity. When we say extrapolative methods, this is more of the predictions that are consistent with past and present data. So we actually have few types of extrapolative methods. We have trend analysis, which is extrapolating present trends modified to take account of changes caused by the project. So we also have scenarios in which common sense forecast of future state based on variety of assumptions. So we can, with the scope of impacts, we can have, for example, scenario 1, and this is the assumption, and this is the possible impact of the project or activity. This is scenario 2, and then we can make an assumption as to what will be the possible impact of the certain project or certain activity. When we say analogies, this is more of the transferring experience from elsewhere to the present study. So for example, on your case, you can actually make an analogy based on the two AA study examples that I gave you. Since they identified there as to what are the possible impacts of the building that are about or the building that you are studying. So you can make an analogy for that based on those studies. Another type of extrapolative method is the intuitive forecasting. This is the use of the Delphi technique to seek group consensus on the impact of a project. Delphi method is sort of a forecasting process framework that is based on the results of multiple rounds of questionnaires sent to a panel of experts. So for example, you have 5 panel of experts, and then you have a survey questionnaire, and you give them the survey questionnaire in which the panel experts will be answering the questionnaire, which is of course based on the predictive impacts that you identified. And then after several rounds that the panel of experts answered your questionnaire, so after several rounds of questionnaires are sent out to the panel of experts, as far as I can remember, the responses, which is in anonymous, so it does not specifically tell as to where the response came from, as to where the response came from the specific judge. So yeah, the anonymous response are aggregated and then shared to the group after each round. And then the group, for example, in your case, you are the group, your group will be aggregating the results and anonymously discusses the response of the panel of judges. And then from that, the group can aggregate as to which impact would relatively, or I would say, would probably, how can I explain it? And then based on, so you have a set of questionnaires, and let us say you have 6 panel of members, and then you gave them a set of questionnaire round 1, and then the panel of judges answered the questionnaire, and then from every round you aggregated or you I would say tally the result. And then another round again on the same set of questionnaire, you gave again the same questionnaire to the panel of judges or the panel of experts, and then they answer again. And then on the next round, and then up to, I would say, several rounds. I do not exactly remember as to how many rounds, but let us say 3, 4, 5 rounds. And then after each round, of course, you have to tally the results. And then after several rounds, you have to make an average to the results based on the panel of judges answers. And then from that, you identify or you tally as to which impacts would tend to have a more probability that would exist after the project or after the activity will be or have been or after the activity will be implemented. In which, as a result, based on the panel of experts, basically you can have or you can forecast as to what will be the most adverse impacts that could or your project or activity could give. Yeah, I hope I answered it yet. Later on the end of the class, I will ask you if you got the Delphi method. All right. So this is an example of the. I think I have an example here on the Delphi method. I hope so. This is an example of a trend analysis in which you can identify or you can check if there is a pattern of change on a specific variables based on the possible impacts of your study. However, with trend analysis, you can know this after the project is being implemented. However, of course, you can also, based on previous studies or based on other studies, you can check as to what is the trend of their analysis based on their results. But basically, when we say trend analysis, we have to consider the time as to the effects or as to the impact of your study after a specific time.
All right, disclaimer. This is a personal YouTube channel. Any views or opinions represented in this YouTube channel are personal and solely belong to me as the owner and do not represent those people, organizations, or institutions that I or may not be associated with in professional or personal capacity unless explicitly stated. Any views or opinions are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, or any individual.
The next method, when it comes to impact prediction, is according to the form of prediction. So we have here, for example, mathematical models. So we can describe cause and effect relationships in the form of flowcharts or mathematical functions, in which there are predictive mathematical models available for particular impacts. The next one example is a balance model or input or output model. So this actually establishes mass balance between mass balance equation for a given compartment, namely a defined physical entity such as lake or a volume of soil or an organism. I actually have illustration on the next slide. When we say also mass balance model or input and output model, it changes in the content of the compartment equal the sum of inputs minus the sum of outputs. Just imagine an input and output flow. So for example, if you have let me show you. I think I can explain more with this illustration. For example, you have a compartment X, and let us say you know the exact volume of the compartment X. And if there is an input A, of course your compartment X will be added with your input A, and for sure you will know what is the current volume in your compartment X. If there will be an output N, and of course you will know what is the volume of your output N, then therefore you can still identify or you can still calculate as to what will be the volume in your compartment X. The same also with your input B. If you know the exact amount of your input P, then therefore you can also know what is the current volume of your compartment X. The same thing with your output M. So in which, for example, we have here change in compartment X would be equal to A plus B. So A plus B minus output M and output M. At a steady state, if the amount, if the volume of input A plus input B is equal to the output of output M and output N, then therefore the volume in your compartment X would be steady or would still be equal to the original state. So that's mass balance model. The next is, of course, statistical models in which we can use regression analysis, which is the easiest one and which is the very common among studies, especially on the effects of time or an effect of one variable to another variable. Next is, of course, the field and laboratory experimental models. So there are EIA studies that before they do a field study per se, or before they do the real project per se, they will have first a field or laboratory experiment for them to be sure as to what will be the impact of their specific project or activity. We also have an analog model. So these predictions are based on analogous situations in which impacts of proposed project are compared with similar existing projects. An analog model can be developed from monitoring of a similar project. So next is also the same with not really the same, but as one of the methods in impact prediction. Of course, the expert opinion based on previous relevant experience may also be used. That is why experts' judgment is very important. Is very important when it comes to impact prediction. We also have choice of prediction methods. So this is the appropriateness of a method for the test involved, and of course the available resources, because it will be hard if you will be pouring out all your project fund in your EIA study. So you have to check your available resources, and at the same time, among the other form of predictions or among the other approaches of predictions, you can actually choose between them, as long as it will give you or it can justify as to what will be your prediction of the impacts of your specific project or study. We also have replicability. So this is free of analyst bias because as long as you will state in your EIA study that your methods are replicable, then therefore anybody can replicate it, and then for sure, if since it is replicable, then therefore it should, or the result should have at least maybe not identical, but the result should be near to each other. So or in short, almost everybody can replicate it when we say replicable. Of course, one of the things that we have to consider when it comes to impact prediction is consistency. So the applicable to different projects to enable comparisons of predictions to be made. That is why, for example, on water quality, since for example, you identified total nitrogen. So after 5 years, you have to analyze total nitrogen of the water and not extractable nitrogen. I'm talking about parameter in extracting. I'm talking about parameter in analyzing nitrogen on water. So, for example, on your baseline study, you quantified, you analyzed total nitrogen. So, during the monitoring and auditing, then therefore, you have to quantify total nitrogen. Because if you will quantify, for example, extractable nitrogen on water, there is a huge difference between total nitrogen and extractable nitrogen. Because when we say total nitrogen, you are actually extracting or you are actually quantifying all forms of nitrogen in the water. When we say extractable nitrogen, you are actually only extracting the available nitrogen for extractable nitrogen for let us say available nitrogen for microorganisms. So when we say available nitrogen, this is the form of nitrogen that organisms or microorganisms can accumulate. So of course, total nitrogen versus extractable nitrogen, of course, there's a huge difference to it. So it will be hard for you to compare the two results. So consistency, especially to the parameters. So in many cases, more than one method may be appropriate. So for example, methods being used in air quality impacts, publish emission data for similar projects, emission factor model, emission standards, Gaussian dispersion methods, expert opinion, mathematical deposition models. So when you did your EIA study and on your baseline information or baseline study, for example, you use or you base your air quality index on the emission standards, then therefore, after 5, 7, or during the monitoring and audit of your project or study, then therefore you have to also use the emission standards. You just have to be consistent as to what kind of method that you use when you did your baseline information or baseline study. So for us to easily compare the results, or for us to compare as to if there is an adverse impact of your study or none. So when we say determination of magnitude of impact, there are actually two methods to that. So we have cause and effect relationship. We have interpolation or interpolation and analogy. And of course, capacity and threshold concepts. So when we say cause and effect relationships, they are used to establish potential magnitude of change due to the project. So we have to consider as to what will be the effect of your project, or what would be or we have to identify the magnitude if it's really your project or impact that cause that specific impact. Next is, of course, the extrapolation, interpolation, and analogy. So when we say extrapolation, it's more of the extent of change. It's based on extending out the trend of a line. When we say interpolation, it is used to estimate the impact when impacts of similar projects are known. So if it's known, it is called as interpolation. When we say extrapolation, that's extending out of a trend of a line, or I would say beyond the trend line. When we say analogy, this is more of between an existing project and a new project that may be applicable depending on the extent of similarity. If there are two existing projects, if there are an already built project and you are going to make a new project, but these two are very similar, then therefore you can make an analogy study of it, or an analogy as to what will be the possible adverse impact of your study based on the existing project. When we say capacity and threshold concepts, this is actually more of the organisms, flora and fauna, that are specifically on the environment. There are areas, or let us say, for example, a lake. We can actually calculate as to what is the assimilative capacity of a certain lake. When we say assimilative capacity, it is the capacity of the lake that it can hold a certain amount of pollution or a certain volume of pollution. And then, since we can calculate the assimilated capacity, we can also calculate as to what is the maximum threshold of the capacity that it can hold or assimilate a certain solution. In which, on that specific case, you can be allowed to pollute. That's actually it sounds wrong. It sounds wrong, but I would say, since there is a threshold, a lake, or there since give me a second. All right. So since the lake has a capacity to hold a certain pollution, then therefore, not a person, but therefore, then therefore, let us say, there's amount of pollution that the lake can accept and hold, since it can assimilate that specific amount of pollution naturally. What I meant is, therefore, the lake can accumulate a specific amount of pollution, and it can still undergo, or it can still do its nutrient cycling naturally. And the lake would not undergo, or it would not come to a point that it would be considered as a polluted lake. In which therefore, if your project or activity would result to an adverse impact to a specific lake, let us say for a specific lake, and if you can calculate that the lake can still assimilate the correct, Dr. Bakunawa, capacity for self-purification, correct. If the lake can still be able to hold, or can still accept the amount of pollution that your project or activity that your certain project or activity can give to that specific lake, then therefore you can justify that your impact prediction, or you can justify that your impact to the specific lake is still okay and still can be mitigated, because the amount of pollution that you given to that specific lake can still be naturally be purified, or can naturally still be assimilated. So that's what we meant by capacity and threshold concepts, in which areas or regions have a carrying capacity for populations based on areas and resources. So that's what it meant by capacity and threshold concepts. So after that impact prediction, of course, we have to evaluate those predictions. So once impact has been predicted, there is a need to assess the relative significance, because there is a possibility that these impacts might not have an adverse impact. It may have an impact to the specific ecosystem or community per se, but its veracity, magnitude, and significance might not be that much. So in this topic, we will analyze the significance of impacts as basis for implementation of mitigating measures. So, of course, as what we've known, or as what we've discussed on the previous meetings, every time that there is an adverse impacts, the best thing we can do, or the very main reason that we have an EIA study, is, of course, to have a mitigating measures to whatever it is, or to what may be the adverse impact of the specific project or activity. So the question of significance of impacts on the natural environment constitute the very heart of the EIA. Of course, the reason why we are conducting an EIA study is, of course, for us to predict what could be the possible impacts of the specific project or activity. So from any perspective, the focus of impact assessment narrows down to judgment whether the predictive impacts are significant. So the concept of significance needs a clear operational framework. We could go for statistical significance, ecological concern, and of course, the social importance. In which the question of significance focuses on the evaluation of significance, involves interpretation and application of judgment. That is why, again, it's very important to have an EIA team that are expert enough to the specific project or specific activity. Because judgment can be rationalized, but of course, all involved values and are all subjective. In which, as you can see in this graph on the left side of the slide, we have here on the vertical line, we have the analytical method. On the horizontal line, we have the intuitive mode. And is this hypotenuse? I forgot. On the third side of the triangle, I forgot the quadratic something in math. Anyhow, on this, as you can see here, judgment lie in a continuum between analytical mode and intuitive mode. When we say analytical mode, it's more of the objective aspect of thinking or of judgment, or analytical mode, it's more of the objective. When we say intuitive mode, it's more of the subjective aspect. Because when we say intuitive, it's more about making a decision, excuse me, or a judgment without no specific or direct reason. It's then, when we say analytical methods, of course, it seeks to introduce a rational approach to evaluation. So this may be carried out by considering the following. So comparison of impacts with legal requirements, standards, and policies on sustainable development. Degree to which plants and animals may be affected. Excuse me. And which to that, in some cases, for example, in a mining activity or in a mining project, of course, flora and fauna will be affected in one way or another. In which that adverse effect can be mitigated through rehabilitation. So I don't know if I have a copy of an AIA study, a full AIA study on a mining project, but I am so sure that before the DNR-AMB issues an ECC to a mining project or mining activity, there is always a decommissioning or abandonment phase of the project, in which on that part, they will be rehabilitating the area. In which on some cases, for example, if it's an open pit mining kind of method, then therefore they have to reclaim the area, and they have to find ways to rehabilitate the area. So maybe they will introduce species of plants that can thrive on a newly rehabilitated mining site, or they can introduce animals. When I went to the US, I actually visited one of the coal mining site in West Virginia. At the same time, we were able also to visit an area that is undergoing a rehabilitation. So it's an open pit kind of mining. So what they did is, of course, they have to reclaim the area. So they have to, they reclaimed the whole pit, like it's a huge pit. They reclaimed the whole pit. However, the problem is what they use are not soil, but a mixture of rocks and sediments of soil. So when they did their plant rehabilitation on that specific area, it was actually quite hard for the plant to grow. In which I suggested for them to not to plant directly first to the soil, but what they can do is, they can dig around a hole, like maybe a 1 meter and 1 meter hole, and then plant the tree there. In which if the tree is already stable, then and its roots are already grounded to the soil per se, then therefore it can go through the rocky or sediment type of soil that they reclaimed on that specific mining site. Anyhow, yeah, degree to which plants and animals may be affected. And then conflict with public opinion or needs. So they have to consider that. And then cumulative impacts which in themselves are not significant. Also, they have to consider under the analytical methods the context of changes relative to time, space, level of biological organization, affected human population and cost, degree to which human health and well-being may be adversely affected, and the potential effect on the protected areas. So the good thing with analytical method is you have a basis. You have a basis as to what will be the significance of the predicted impacts of your specific project or activity. And, not just basically based on intuition. However, since there are a lot of analytical methods, you can actually just choose a few or just choose one, whatever is most applicable to your identified impact, identified predicted impacts. For evaluation criteria, there are actually a lot of criteria that we can choose from. We can use the statistical significance. We can use social values, in which, for me, it's actually in the context of soil scientists, experts, it's easy for them to quantify social values. But on my case, it's hard on my case. However, in an EIA study, if there will be an adverse impact to the community per se, then therefore we have to do a social analysis to that. Another evaluation criteria is economic values, in which we can do economic analysis, ecological protection considerations, health and safety concerns, risk potential, existing laws and regulation, and consideration for sustainability. Again, it depends on the specific identified predictive impacts of your specific project or activity. And among this criteria, you can choose one or two, whichever is applicable or most appropriate. I think that's a correct word, appropriate. And then, of course, we have methods of evaluation. We actually have two types of methods of evaluation. First one is based on common single criterion, which is money. So we could have benefit or cost analysis. We can identify the benefits and the cost of the specific project, and then from that, we can evaluate if the study per se is worth doing or not. So we can have more comprehensive in scope and include tangibles and intangibles. At the same time, it takes long view and wide view of projects. We can also identify the net social benefit and the net social cost. And it has some limitation, though, when it comes to benefit cost analysis. Because identifying and monetizing intangibles, when you say intangibles, these are the kind of things that we cannot give values. And of course, the choice of the discount rate. The standard discount rate is 5%. But there are studies that considers above or below that discount rate, in which, of course, we have to make a basis when it comes to the benefit cost analysis. We have to make a basis as to what will be our discount rate. The next method of evaluation is based on multi-criteria analysis. So the method seeks to allow for a pluralist view of society composed of diverse stakeholders with diverse goals and values concerning environmental changes. We can do scoring method. We may use qualitative or quantitative scales according to availability of information on the impact under consideration. We can also use being. So it's a scale given and agreed by the team. So the team can agree as to what will be the way. And of course, we can use the Delphi method. So this is on expert of opinion, or the Delphi panel on various issues are collected and consensus among them is worked out. So this is the one that I was trying to explain to you earlier. Again, like for example, you have a set of questionnaire, and then a set of questionnaire of the predictive impacts of your specific project or activity. And then you give out that questionnaire to the panel of experts on several rounds. On first round, it's actually the same questionnaire, but you can shuffle the question. On each round, you will tallying the results and try to look at on the first round which of the predictive impacts would likely happen based on the panel of experts opinion. And then again on the next round, the second round, third, fourth, and so on and so forth. And then you make an average. And then from that, you can identify which among the predictive impacts that would likely happen based on the experts' opinion. So that's basically the Delphi panel. So we can evaluate level of significance of each predicted impact. We can use 0 to 3, not significant. So this is actually more of the method of scoring. And we can also indicate with symbols when it comes to levels of significance. We can have a dot with halo dot, not significant, with a full dot, moderate, and a bigger dot, which is a serious. So that's on the multi-criteria analysis. So basically, that's how you evaluate the methods. I mean, these are the two methods of evaluating the identified predictive impacts of your specific project or activity. To that, do you have any questions? I know you have a lot of questions.